Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. My name is Ann Schmid, and I'm a Senior Policy Advisor for ICF. I've only been with ICF since December, and prior to that, I served as the Disaster Recovery Team Leader for the state of Iowa. For the state of Iowa, I oversaw the management of multiple CDBG disaster recovery grants, those that I both inherited in that role, saw from the beginning, and successfully closed out. So I've been able to work in the life cycle of CDBG-DR for about the past 10 years, and I'm excited to share with you all today some information and helpful tips for administering what we're calling small CDBG-DR projects. So thank you for joining us this afternoon. The objectives of today are to inform grantees on first steps in setting up your CDBG-DR program. We hope that you'll leave with an understanding of the financial requirements that you'll be completing through this process. You'll hear basic concepts of program funding, and hopefully you'll be able to plan for successful implementation. So for the agenda today, we're going to go through this in an order of talking about just your initial first steps, an analysis of funding, a robust conversation about capacity, a brief conversation about programming or your method of distribution, and then I'll hopefully provide some best practices and common missteps before we break out into breakout sessions that we'll talk about later. So for these first steps, for those of you on the line, you may be brand new CDBG-DR grantees, or you may be seasoned and experienced grantees. However, for anyone joining the call or on this session, it's important to know where to find the playbook for how you will manage your CDBG disaster recovery funding. And because these funds are not an annually allocated program that Congress sets aside in the annual budget, they are instead supplemental funds, which means that anytime Congress passes this funding and they designate funds to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD then issues special Federal Register notices that outline the rules, requirements, and funding for this program. So the very first thing to know is to know your Federal Register notice. Every CDBG-DR grantee has their allocation of funding identified through an allocation Federal Register notice. For the most recent class, those 2020 grantees, where HUD issued a press release in the fall and then identified specific program requirements this past winter, those can be found in the consolidated notice with the applicability date of February 8th, 2022. This is a screenshot here of what that notice looks like. And the notice is important because it outlines not only the funding, the rules of the game, it also identifies those requirements that you need to meet and the timeframes. So one of the first things that you'll need to do is a management and oversight of funds assessment. This is called a certification checklist, and HUD provides a template for that. And those are due to HUD 60 days from the applicability of the notice. You also will see in the notice that you need to do an implementation plan. This is your opportunity as a grantee to share with HUD how you intend to structure these funds and what resources you have in terms of staffing and tools and capacity in order to implement those programs. That is due 120 days from the notice, which aligns well with the public action plan because in some way, you have to know what types of programs you're offering in order to know how you will implement them. This most recent consolidated notice allows for grantees access to administrative funds in advance of finalizing many of these requirements. And that's an excellent opportunity for grantees to be able to use the financial resources made available right away to help in these planning and program design efforts. The most recent consolidated notice allows for an admin-only action plan, which does require a plan request to be submitted to HUD, but has a shortened public comment period of just 7 days. In addition to knowing your Federal Register notice, it's critically important that you know your disaster. So all CDBG-DR funds are funded based on a federally declared disaster event that occurred within a city or a municipality. And that disaster event was presidentially declared and received a FEMA declaration number. For FEMA disasters, there are varying degrees of county designation between the types of programs that are triggered under the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Public assistance and individual assistance, and those counties that provided both. In addition to that designation, HUD has identified most impacted and distressed areas, typically counties, but often identified in zip codes. This map here just depicts a disaster event, the Mississippi Disaster Declaration 4576 that occurred in December of 2020. And you can see here that the pink shaded disasters are those that triggered both FEMA, individual assistance, and public assistance. And yet the red square is the one county that HUD designated as a most impacted and distressed county. And that's important to identify because those are the areas where HUD is requiring the majority of your disaster recovery funds be expended. Now we'll talk a little bit about funding. So when that Federal Register notice is published, it not only outlines the requirements of the grantee to comply with HUD programs, and it sets those timeframes for things that you need to disperse, it also allocates the funds. So if you're ever curious about disaster recovery funding or allocations by HUD for this funding type, you can always find them in a published Federal Register notice. This is a screenshot from the most recent notice allocating funds for the 2020 disasters. You'll notice in this allocation, the first column is the FEMA declaration number, and sometimes there are multiple. The state, the grantee, so sometimes the grantee can be an entitlement community within a state. And then here, this consolidated notice identifies the initial allocation amount, and then HUD has identified a supplemental mitigation fund, and then the total allocation amount. So in the past, HUD has offered many different types of funding, from dedicated mitigation funding alone to resiliency funding. And in this approach, they're combining a 15% mitigation set aside with the initial allocation in order to really stand grantees up with the financial ability to respond to the disaster in a way that prevents future damage or allows for stronger design and hardening for projects to overcome disaster events. Within that allocation, we also see that most impacted and distressed. So again, looking back at that map that I shared previously, HUD has identified the counties or zip codes that are considered most impacted and distressed. According to the most current notice, 80% of the CDBG funds must be expended within those geographic areas. Now, the Federal Register notice allows for 5% of the total allocation to be used for administration. This slide walks you through a new grantee, presumably with a smaller award. In this case, we've used $50 million to think about the use of administrative funds. So the simple math would be to take 5% of that $50 million, or $2,500,000, and divide it over the length of the grant. So you have 6 years to perform these projects. That gives you about $416,000 per year. Some grantees may think, okay, well, I can fund a couple of salaries for the duration of the grant, and that's what I can afford with admin. But the reality is that admin tends to be very heavily front-loaded. We talked earlier about those requirements to complete your financial management certifications, to develop your action plan, to set up activity guidelines and programming. And sometimes those things, in order to quickly meet those HUD requirements, you have to invest resources or administrative funds up front. So the table here shows maybe a more realistic front-loaded admin approach where you might have to procure out for technical assistance or consulting services within that first year and incur a higher amount of admin. And then the admin tapers down, but you certainly want to make sure that you're maintaining admin for all of the administrative activities that would occur during those 6 years. So from action plan development and program guidelines in the first year to launching programs, managing awards, monitoring activities in years 3 and 4, and ultimately closing out activities and then closing out with HUD. So making sure that you're forecasting the use of your administrative funds for the duration of your 6-year grant is important. And this does become a bit of a challenge with smaller grantees because the requirements to program your funding and meet the rules of the Federal Register notice are the same, no matter how large or small your grant award is, but your admin is always a percentage. So most smaller grantees will have smaller geographic areas that they are serving, fewer most impacted and distressed counties identified, and can hone their resources to fewer programs or to smaller geographic areas, which may result in some efficiencies, but there is still an administrative load, administrative work that needs to be taken into consideration for the duration of the grant. When we think about admin, it's important to think about how we report our funding to HUD. CDBG-DR funds are reported to HUD through the DR-GR online system. In that system, grantees are able to establish administrative line items, both for the state or the municipal grantee directly, as well as for other entities that may be providing administrative costs. Those line items come out of that 5% budget we just talked about. In addition to admin, there are direct costs, the costs that are associated with performing an eligible CDBG activity, and there are activity delivery costs. Now, those two things get combined together when you report in DR-GR. And the reason for that is that activity delivery costs, those costs that are incurred for the purpose or for the successful implementation of an eligible activity, are tied to the beneficiaries that you're reporting on that eligible activity. So on this table here, we've shaded the admin cost in green to indicate that they stand alone, even though they're necessary for you to operate CDBG funding. The activity delivery costs are those that are necessary for the completion of an eligible activity. But it is important as you think about how your capacity and staffing is going to handle this, there may be things at the state level that you are doing that can be counted as activity delivery costs. And so taking those things into consideration early on helps you understand how you will best utilize your administration costs and how some of the activities can be billed directly to projects through activity delivery cost. One of the great resources within CDBG and CDBG-DR is the ability to expend funds on planning. The consolidated notice allows for 15% of the total allocation to be spent on planning. Planning efforts that demonstrate a benefit for those resources in the most impacted and distressed counties can count towards that 80% requirement. I think that planning is especially significant for new and smaller grantees because you can use those resources to help identify what are the best types of programs that you can offer with limited resources. It will also help you identify how you can integrate the mitigation requirements with your 15% mitigation set aside into projects. So plan to keep on planning, quick wins versus long-term success, things that change and evolve. What can we do today versus planning for future changes? So CDBG-DR funds really do focus on how can we build back in a more resilient, stronger, hardening, more mitigated factors in our design. And so using planning resources to make sure that we're not just putting back what was there before that could be subject to repetitive damage, but that we're thinking through what are the best materials, the best designs, and utilizing all of the current research, knowledge, and data that's available to inform those plans for better programming. So now to talk a little bit about capacity. And this is what I think is really at the heart of working with grantees who have smaller amounts of CDBG-DR allocation. Because as I said, the rules are essentially the same if you get 1 million or if you get 900 million. But you have to be savvy in the sense of how you're going to utilize your resources. So knowing what your current staff availability is important. I included this org chart, one, because it's from the state that I've formerly worked with, but two, because I think it demonstrates a really good example of how to integrate into existing resources. So, our states and our entitlement grantees that have existing CDBG programs will be very familiar with the cross-cutting requirements of the CDBG program, the basics of eligible activities and national objectives. And so tapping into your existing resources is very important. Now, we've seen throughout the years, the grantees that get multi-million or billion-dollar disasters have the capacity and have the funding to sort of stand up disaster recovery arms of their existing government system and almost work CDBG-DR entirely separately from the annual program. But grantees that receive smaller allocations, it's really to their benefit to integrate into existing policies, processes, procedures. And I think it's even more important today when we look at the way that the CDBG-CV, coronavirus funds under the CARES Act, were allocated to the annual program. Those required integration of many of the things that we do in disaster recovery, and I'll get to those in a little bit, but just things like quarterly reporting and duplication of benefits, some of those requirements that previously only existed for CDBG-DR are now being seen in your annual program for the CV funds. And so partnering with the folks that run those programs and figuring out if you have capacity there to supplement your CDBG-DR programs. It's also important to question if you need to procure professional services. So we all know in working with these funds, compliance with 2 CFR 200 and competitive procurement is critically important. Identifying those needs up front gives you the greatest advantage to being able to bring on technical assistance providers or consultants to support you if you don't have the in-house resources to meet those deliverables to HUD. And then not only do you need to think about your capacity at your level as the grantee, but if you'll be awarding down to subrecipients or units of local government, what are their capacity? Do we have regional planning entities? And how will you sort of teach out the rules about this new program? Because every CDBG-DR program, every Federal Register notice outlines new rules for the game. And so making sure that you have good relationships with subrecipients and that they know that these funds are different and that these programs will be unique and will be specific to this disaster recovery effort. There are also really great models out there of partnering with local nonprofits to share in implementation roles. And so really knowing your resources and knowing who's available and who's doing this kind of work will help you with designing efficient implementation. So just to get back quickly to this organizational chart, this is for the Iowa Economic Development Authority, and it does go all the way up to the governor of the state of Iowa. And while the disaster recovery team has a team leader and what looks like 4 team members on it, many of those team members cross-populate with both the annual program as well as other economic development programs that are not shown on this org chart. At the current time, I believe the DR staff is actually 2 dedicated employees, and that's about what I was familiar with when working there. And so I think it's just important to know what your current staff can do and know how you can structure a DR team within your existing resources to the best of your ability. So as we look at the resources available through the CDBG-DR program, you'll need to start thinking about how you want to spend those funds. So the very first step is identifying those needs and the disaster unmet needs. So looking at impact and damage assessments from your disaster event. Will you need data sharing agreements, particularly with your emergency management counterparts who run and operate the FEMA programs? And then that question of capacity on additional staffing versus consulting services in order to meet the requirements. Think about the number of programs that you'll want to run. Some disasters, depending on their funding level, will have enough funding to support multiple programs where you can address a variety of housing needs or infrastructure programs, but others may expend all of their CDBG-DR in just 1 or 2 programs. You'll need to think about how you'll use that 15% mitigation set aside. It could be standalone projects, such as the construction of watershed management practices to hold water from inundating and causing flooding. Or it could be integrated mitigation into the construction of new facilities or new housing, such as hardening construction or elevating buildings. And like I said earlier, really thinking about utilizing your existing CDBG resources and the staff who are currently working in the compliance areas of cross-cutting regulations. So if you operate an annual CDBG program and have an environmental officer who assists with those environmental review record reviews, if you currently have team members who are familiar with labor standards, Davis-Bacon wages, and issuing wage rates, if you have a Section 3 head who's monitoring those Section 3 labor hours for reporting purposes, the folks that are operating any contractor clearances and SAM.gov checks, anyone on your team who is knowledgeable and experienced in the Uniform Relocation Act. And then also, as I said, the duplication of benefits, which has historically been sort of a disaster-only policy, has now sort of crept into our annual CDBG folks through the award of the CARES Act funds and the requirements to meet that. So these are all things that folks who are operating and managing CDBG funding for the state or for the entitlement community should have some knowledge or familiarity with. And these are things that you can take advantage of that existing knowledge and integrate it into your CDBG-DR program. And then one more thing on capacity is just sort of thinking about technology and thinking about where you can improve and integrate technology. We have changed a lot over the last decade in how we operate and manage our federal fundings and federal grant programs. The annual CDBG program does have an administrative match. The CDBG-DR program does not have that. So, thinking about how your funds or even some of your project delivery can be identified or can benefit from technology is very helpful. Utilizing technology for program applications, compliance documentation, cloud-based records, beneficiary statistics, the things that are needed to report to HUD that you've met a national objective. Transparent monitoring, I think a lot of folks have gone to an electronic monitoring system of sub-grantees or sub-recipients. And especially as a result of the pandemic, we found that by having online systems, it's more transparent for everyone. You know what questions are coming, and you're able to prepare and respond. And then certainly having technology tools to be able to meet those HUD quarterly progress reports. All right, so I want to take a few minutes and just talk you through some helpful hints in programming your method of distribution for your CDBG-DR funds. So what you'll need to do when you start designing your programs is to really look at that unmet needs assessment and let that unmet needs assessment. So when you first have CDBG-DR funds, you're looking at that disaster impact. You're looking at how significant the damage of the disaster event was in terms of housing, economic development, infrastructure. And then you're looking at what programs have already been provided to meet some of those needs. How much FEMA funding was made available, how much state funding or other independent programs were available, and then what are those remaining unmet needs that CDBG-DR can be used to fill. The consolidated notice states that programming must demonstrate a reasonably proportionate allocation of resources relative to the areas and categories of greatest needs identified in the grantees impacted and unmet needs assessment. So in prior years, HUD has had language in their notices about primarily serving housing needs first. This has shifted a bit in the most recent notice, and this new language about proportionate allocation is what HUD will be looking for. So it's important to make sure that as you're designing your programs, you're looking at your unmet needs assessment and making sure that you're filling those highest needs first. We talked a little bit about this earlier, but really thinking about how many programs will you offer? Think about the development of guidelines, applications, review forms, contracts. Every different type of program may trigger a different form, different contract, different application. And so just making sure that you're considering how much administration and how much delivery funding you have available to you, and making sure that you're not overstretching your abilities for your capacity based on your grant. And then how long has it been since your disaster event? I think about this quite often, that the HUD, the special appropriation of funding from Congress, there's no guarantee that it occurs within any given amount of time from a disaster event. So some grantees have been waiting, close to 2 years now from their disaster event. And so really looking at those remaining unmet needs from a timing perspective, those folks who may have had the highest barriers to other resources and other programs should be prioritized. The folks who have not been able to relocate or recover in the significant amount of time since the disaster event. So making sure that you're programming to those greatest needs. So one thing that I do with when states that I've worked with have received federal funds is I think about programs as a table of percentages at first, because so much of the HUD program is geared towards percentage requirements, the percentage of serving low to moderate income persons, the percentage of funding in the most impacted and distressed, the percentage of funding for mitigation or resilient mitigation. And so what I did here is I just outlined a very basic, very simple program that takes sort of the big buckets, the projects or programs of housing, infrastructure, economic development, planning, and admin. And then I just put in the basic percentages. So this is a fictional example, and we're going to say that in our fictional example, our unmet needs assessment indicated the highest need was housing, but we also had some need for infrastructure and some need for planning. And so just simply based on percentages, I went ahead and added $50 million for a CDBG award. I see that there is a question in the chat about, what are we determining small project? And there is no distinctive definition of small project. When we first approached this presentation, we put HUD suggested 50 million. We realized, especially with the most recent press release last week that provides additional funding sources for some entitlement grantees. There are awards that are as low as, $5 or $7 million, and awards that are as high as hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. And so, small, we really focused around that 50 million. But what I like to do with this table and this tool is to see how viable programs are. So once you start assigning an allocation amount to percentages, you can get a sense of if your percentages are too high or too low. And so I kept the same percentages again and adjusted it to a $65 million award. And now you can see here that just based on percentage, 10% of 65 million, 6.5 million may be too much for a planning program. And so a grantee may want to bring that down a bit, and they may want to beef up infrastructure or perhaps the new construction programs. And so this really gives you an opportunity to sort of test how percentages flow with your funding. And again, the same percentages based on a $35 million. And so you can start to see how the funding could be allocated to programs like this, and sort of what is expected to convey to the public how you as a grantee will be expending those funds. So we're going to take just a few minutes and talk about common missteps and best practices. So document the requirements. So one of the biggest things that comes out of sessions like this, and as you work towards starting your program, is to be as familiar as you can with that Federal Register notice, and utilize the HUD resources and the programs, but really try and make yourself a list of what are the things that I have to hit? What are those really important requirements? How can I build tools or work with consultants and technical assistants to build tools to make sure that I'm hitting my percentages, that I know the rules at the beginning, because it's very difficult to shift and change to meet rules once you've got programs out there and in the public and folks applying. The last thing you want to do is establish programs that are not eligible, or that you have to add additional complex regulations to make them eligible. You want to make sure that you've thought about those requirements up front to make it easier for you to complete. And so the financial certifications really is HUD's helpful tool in walking you through those requirements so that you know what you're getting into, and you can sort of prove to yourself and to HUD that you are capable and ready to run these programs. If you're going to make awards down to subrecipients, it's also a great idea to develop a mini certifications for any subrecipients or grantees that are going to be responsible for these funds. Again, disaster recovery funding, CDBG-DR, it changes almost every notice. Now, HUD has taken really thoughtful steps this time around to establish a notice that the intent is that it will have longer legs into the future. But we are always adaptable to changes. And so making sure that folks know that this is not the same as it was previously, that there are new rules, new requirements, and just making sure that you're clearly articulating what those are. Just keeping in mind that you're responsible for these funds. As much as it's helpful to award down to subrecipients or to contract out for services, at the end of the day, the grantee is held responsible for these funds. And even though we delegate responsibility down for different parts of the process, we still have to have those processes documented, and we have to make sure that we are maintaining strong record keeping, we are monitoring, and we are ensuring oversight for all of those policies. And then lastly, I just wanted to talk a little bit about thinking a program through all the way from start to finish. So while not everyone on this call is going to be responsible for entering performance metrics in the DR-GR reporting system, it's really helpful as someone who is planning your CDBG-DR programming for your action plan to sit down with a DR-GR specialist or a DR-GR manual and see how specific activity types do report out. Because if you can go sort of backwards from this is how I would report to HUD my accomplishment to what beneficiary information is needed for that reporting, to what eligible activity am I selecting in DR-GR, to which big bucket project does this fit out of my budget from, to does it meet a national objective, is it an eligible activity, and have I met an unmet need? So going through that list backwards best informs you to sort of start at the beginning and say, I've got an unmet needs assessment. It identified this housing need. I'm going to develop a program, and now I'm going to walk forward through each of these decision questions to make sure that before I publish my action plan for public comment, I'm presenting a program concept that complies with the HUD requirements.